One life changed eternity. Welcome to Justice and Glory. Together.
Imagine a man stepping into a river to be baptized, about to begin 3 years that would change the course of history, and realize that almost no one standing on the bank had any real idea where he had spent the previous 18. We know the child in the manger. We know the teacher on the hillside. We know his final week in Jerusalem in more detail than almost any other event in the ancient world. But between a boy of 12 in the temple and a man of 30 at the Jordan River, the Gospels fall almost completely silent. 18 years, close to 2/3 of his life, with no story attached. For centuries, people have refused to leave that silence alone, filling it with secret journeys to the far corners of the earth. But before we chase the legends, there is a better question to ask. When Scripture says nothing, what can history actually tell us? Jerusalem, Passover week, around the age of 12. Look closely at the shape of the record, and something surprising appears. The Gospel of Luke hands us one vivid scene from the boyhood of Jesus, and then shuts the door. His family travels to Jerusalem for the Passover, the way they did every year. The festival ends, the caravan starts home toward Galilee, and the boy is missing. After 3 days of searching, his parents find him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions that leave the experts amazed. He is 12 years old. When his mother asks why he has treated them this way, he answers with the first words the Gospels ever record from his lips. A reply about needing to be in the things that belong to his father. And then Luke writes a single sentence that quietly covers almost 2 decades. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. That is the door closing. The next time we meet him in the same gospel, he is about 30 years old and stepping into public life at the Jordan. Between those 2 moments, there is no anecdote, no miracle, no journey, no teaching. Just that one line about a child who kept growing. Matthew and Mark tell us nothing about the gap at all. John does not touch it. 4 Gospels, and for 18 years, near total silence. For centuries, that silence has felt like a problem, waiting to be solved. But before we try to fill it, it is worth asking a very different question. Why is it there in the first place? Here is what almost everyone misses. The Gospels are not biographies in the way we use that word today. A modern biography chases childhood, formative wounds, early influences, the private years that supposedly explain the public figure. Ancient biography, the kind of writing the Gospel authors were actually producing, worked in another way entirely. Many New Testament scholars place the Gospels within a first-century literary form, often called a bios, a life, and these ancient lives routinely passed over childhood, almost completely. What mattered was a person's public career, their character revealed in action, and above all, the manner of their death. A reader in the Roman world would not have found the missing years strange at all. They might have found our modern hunger for baby stories and school records slightly baffling. So, the silence is not a gap the Gospel writers forgot to fill. It is a shape their kind of writing naturally produced. Luke even opens his account by telling us he has carefully investigated everything and is setting it down in order, which is a way of admitting he is selecting, shaping, choosing what serves his purpose. And that purpose was never to satisfy curiosity about a Galilean childhood. It was to testify to a ministry, a death, and what his followers proclaimed came after. But human beings cannot leave an empty page alone for long. Within a century or 2 of Jesus, other writers rushed in to fill it. Texts we now call the apocryphal Gospels appeared, and one of the most famous of them, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, imagines the child Jesus working wonders in the streets of Nazareth, shaping sparrows out of clay and clapping his hands to send them flying. The early church did not accept these writings, and historians do not treat them as records of anything that happened. They are something else. They are the earliest evidence of a very old instinct, When the story goes quiet, people will always try to write the missing chapter themselves. Which brings us back to the better question. Set the legends aside. What does solid history actually know about the world in which those 18 years were lived? Nazareth, in Galilee. A place too small for the history books. Start with the town itself. We hear the name Nazareth and picture somewhere of importance because of who came from there. In the 1st century, it was the opposite. Nazareth appears nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. It is absent from the writings of the historian Josephus, a man who knew Galilee intimately, commanded troops there, and named dozens of its towns, yet never once mentions this one. It does not surface in the early rabbinic sources either. This was a settlement so small and so obscure that the wider world had simply never heard of it. The Gospel of John captures the reputation in a single line when a man named Nathanael hears where Jesus is from and asks whether anything good can come out of Nazareth. That was the attitude. A nowhere place, and the archaeology supports that picture. For a long time, the physical evidence was thin enough that a fringe theory even claimed 1st century Nazareth had not existed at all. Excavation has answered that theory. Digs at several sites in and around the modern city have uncovered rock-cut tombs of a distinctly Jewish kind. Storage pits, cisterns, agricultural terraces, watchtowers, and presses for wine and olive oil. A project known as the Nazareth Village Farm reconstructed the daily rhythm of the place and found what you would expect: a small farming community of devout Jews of modest means. Estimates of its population in the time of Jesus are strikingly low, often somewhere between 200 and 500 people. This was not a city. It was a hamlet. Then comes the most evocative find of all. Beneath the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth, in the center of the modern town, the nuns had been digging since the late 19th century, in one of the earliest excavations ever led by a woman. In recent years, the archaeologist Ken Dark studied the site with modern methods and identified among the tombs and later church remains what appears to be a 1st century courtyard house cut partly into the living rock, a local tradition recorded by a pilgrim who visited around the year 380, held that this was the house where Jesus grew up. Dark is careful and honest about the limits of what he found. It is a genuine 1st century Nazareth dwelling. Whether it belonged to that particular family, he says plainly, is impossible to prove. What the stones give us is not an address. What they give us is a world. Small, poor, agricultural, and thoroughly Jewish. And in that world, a boy would have grown up inside a rhythm we can actually reconstruct. 6 days of labor and a Sabbath of rest. The village synagogue, where the scriptures of Israel were read aloud and discussed. This raises one of the quiet puzzles of the missing years. When Jesus finally returns to Nazareth as a grown man, Luke tells us that, as was his custom, he went into the synagogue, stood up, and read from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He could read. Later, in the Gospel of John, a crowd marvels and asks how this man knows his letters when he never studied under a rabbi. In 1st century Galilee, most people could not read at all. Literacy was low, especially among village laborers. So how did the son of a craftsman in a hamlet of a few hundred people become someone who could stand and read the prophets and argue scripture with the trained? Scholars debate exactly how far his education went, but the likeliest answer runs through that synagogue and that Sabbath, through a boyhood of hearing, memorizing, and absorbing the sacred text of his people. Whatever else those hidden years contained, they contained scripture. Now, what did his hands do in that world for all those years? The Gospels give us exactly one word. When Jesus comes back to Nazareth as a grown man and teaches in the synagogue, the very crowd who watched him grow up takes offense, and they place him with a phrase. Mark's Gospel records their words. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? It is the only verse in the entire New Testament that names his own trade directly. Matthew's version calls him the carpenter's son, pointing instead at Joseph. And the word sitting underneath the English is worth stopping on. The Greek word is tekton. For centuries, English Bibles have rendered it carpenter, and that image of a man at a workbench with wood shavings around his feet has settled into our imagination and stayed there. But tekton is broader than a worker in wood. In ancient Greek, it meant a craftsman or builder who worked in hard materials, and, depending on the region and the task, that could mean wood, or stone, or even metal. The older translators reached for carpenter, partly because they lived in lands full of timber, where wood was the natural thing to build with. In the stony hills of Galilee, good building wood was relatively scarce, and stone was the ordinary material. A number of modern scholars now argue that the truest translation is something closer to builder or builder-craftsman, a skilled laborer who could frame a roof or dress a block of limestone. This was hard, physical work, and in the ancient world it carried no glamour. It calloused the hands. It marked a man as a laborer, not a scholar, which makes the puzzle of his learning sharper still. There is one more detail that scholars often notice. Mark identifies Jesus through his mother, the carpenter, the son of Mary, rather than through his father. In that culture, a man was normally named as the son of his father. Some historians read the phrasing as a quiet sign that Joseph had already died by this point, which fits the way Joseph simply disappears from the story after the childhood scenes and is never mentioned again during the ministry. Others hear less in it. The text itself does not explain. But it leaves us with a plausible and deeply human picture. A young man who had most likely lost his father, working a demanding trade to help hold a household together in a village at the edge of nowhere. Sepphoris, 4 miles over the valley. And here is where the ordinary suddenly turns extraordinary, because that village at the edge of nowhere had a neighbor, just under 4 miles from Nazareth. A walk of little more than an hour over a low valley stood a city that the Gospels never once name. Its name was Sepphoris. And during the very years Jesus was growing from a boy into a working man, Sepphoris was one of the largest and most dramatic building projects in all of Galilee. The story of that city is written across the pages of Josephus. When Herod the Great died, around the time of Jesus' birth, revolt broke out across the region. In Galilee, a rebel seized Sepphoris and its arsenal. Rome answered with overwhelming force. The Roman governor of Syria, a man named Varus, marched in, and according to Josephus, the city was burned and many of its people were sold into slavery. Then Herod's son, Herod Antipas, inherited Galilee, and he chose the ruins of Sepphoris to rebuild as his shining capital. Josephus says Antipas fortified the city and made it the ornament of all Galilee, and renamed it in honor of the emperor. Archaeologists have since uncovered its remains, an upper and a lower city, colonnaded streets, water systems, a royal quarter, and a theater carved into the hillside. Now hold the two facts side by side. A building, boom, right next door, hungry for skilled workers in wood and stone, and a young builder craftsman in the village just over the hill. The Gospels never say the two things met. But a number of scholars have found the connection almost impossible to ignore, and some have argued that Joseph and Jesus may well have found work among the craftsmen rebuilding Sepphoris. It is a reconstruction, not a fact, and it deserves to be labeled as exactly that. We should also be honest that scholars debate the dating of some of the grandest ruins, and the Great Theater in particular may belong to a period later than Jesus' youth, while the excavations have not confirmed every detail of Josephus' account of the destruction. What is solid is the setting. A poor Galilean laborer did not grow up sealed away from the Roman world. He grew up an hour's walk from its architecture, its officials, its soldiers, and the raw memory of a revolt that Rome had crushed without mercy. The atmosphere of those years was heavy with taxation and unrest. Both Josephus and the New Testament remember another Galilean named Judas, who rose up against a Roman census and tax not long after, and perished for it. This was the air Jesus breathed while he grew. Whatever those 18 years held, they were lived in that shadow, between a tiny devout village and a glittering taxed Roman-shaped city just over the ridge. Which returns us at last to the little that the text itself does say, and to the words themselves. Remember that first recorded sentence, the 12-year-old in the temple answering his mother. The Greek phrase Luke uses is famously open. It can be translated, "I must be in my Father's house," or "I must be about my Father's business," or simply, "I must be among the things that belong to my Father." Translators have argued over that single line for generations because the words genuinely hold more than one meaning at once. Whatever the boy meant by it, Luke said it right at the threshold of the silence on purpose, as if to say, this is the direction those hidden years were quietly pointing. And then that closing sentence, that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. The verb Luke chooses is one that means to advance, to make progress, to move steadily forward. It is not the language of a finished figure standing still. It is the language of formation, of someone in the long process of becoming. In one short line, the gospel offers its own answer to the mystery of the missing years. They were not empty. They were the years he grew. The Himalayas, the year 1894. But an answer that quiet has never satisfied everyone. And this is where the famous legends of the missing years were born. Most of them far more recently than people assume. In 1894, a Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich published a book claiming that during the lost years, Jesus had journeyed east to India and Tibet to study with Buddhist and Hindu masters. His evidence, he said, was an ancient manuscript, the life of Saint Issa, shown to him by monks at the Hemis monastery in Ladakh, while he recovered from a broken leg. The book was a sensation. It was also almost certainly a fabrication. The renowned scholar Max Muller challenged it at once, and a professor named Archibald Douglas traveled to that very monastery in 1895 and interviewed the head lama, who stated flatly that no such manuscript existed and that no Russian answering Notovich's description had ever been treated there. Today, the consensus among historians is plain. The story of Jesus in India rests on a hoax. A second legend sailed in another direction entirely, toward the coast of Britain. A medieval tradition, cherished around the town of Glastonbury in England, held that Joseph of Arimathea, the man who buried Jesus, had been a tin merchant and that he had once brought the young Jesus with him by sea to the British Isles. It is the legend behind William Blake's famous poem of 1804, later set to music as the hymn Jerusalem, which asks whether those feet in ancient time truly walked upon England's mountains green. It is beautiful. It is also, as far as any evidence goes, entirely without foundation. A folklore scholar who examined it closely concluded there is little sign the tale of Jesus visiting Britain even existed before the early 20th century. These stories endure not because history supports them, but because the silence is so wide and the wish to fill it so strong. So when we finally ask, what history can tell us about the missing years of Jesus, the honest answer comes in two halves. History cannot hand us a diary. It cannot document where he stood on a given day, what he built, or what he said at 15 or at 25. On that, the record truly is silent, and the great legends that claim otherwise, the manuscript in a Himalayan monastery, the boat to Britain, simply do not survive examination. But history can do something the legends never could. It can rebuild the world those years were lived in, with real evidence, stone by stone. A tiny Jewish village too small for the history books. A hard building trade, worked with the hands. A father who most likely died young. A gleaming Roman city rising just over the hill. Raised on the ashes of a rebellion. A childhood of Sabbaths and synagogue and scripture, of taxes and occupation and ordinary labor. That is not a gap, that is a portrait. And it may be that the silence was never hiding a secret at all. It may be that the silence is itself the message. For 18 long years, the answer to where he was turns out to be almost startlingly plain. He was home. He was working. He was, in the fullest and most human sense of those words, growing up. Perhaps that is the part worth carrying with you. We are trained to believe that the important years of a life are the visible ones, the years with an audience, the years that get written down. And here is a life where nearly 2/3 of it left no record at all, and no one has ever dared suggest those years were wasted. They were the years that made everything after them possible. The hidden work, the unremarkable town, the ordinary trade, all of it was a life being formed in a place where no one was watching. Maybe the missing years of Jesus were never truly missing. Maybe they were only quiet, and maybe the reason we keep trying to fill that silence with voyages to distant lands is that we have forgotten how much can be built in a small place by a pair of working hands across long and unrecorded years. If this drew you in, stay with us. In the next chapter of this series, we will turn to another silence the Gospels leave wide open and ask what the evidence and the history can still bring back into the light.